You've got your timer set, your coffee ready, and 25 minutes on the clock. You start slow, which feels normal. Then around minute 18, you actually lock in. The thinking sharpens, the ideas start connecting, and right as you hit your stride, the alarm fires. You lose the thread. You take a 5-minute break you didn't want, and then spend the next block trying to rebuild something you already had. That's not productivity. That's a loop that burns more energy than it saves, and there's a smarter way to run your mornings. What if that slow, foggy feeling at the start of every work session isn't a focus problem at all? What if it's actually your brain doing exactly what it needs to do before it can perform at its best? Most productivity advice treats a slow start like a bug. You're told to sit down, start the clock, and get moving fast. But your brain doesn't boot up like a laptop. It warms up, and that warm-up isn't optional, it's biological. The mismatch between how productivity systems are built and how your brain actually works costs you hours every single day. Not because you're lazy, but because you're following a system designed for the wrong kind of work. Researchers who study flow state found that reaching genuine deep focus takes time. For most people, crossing the threshold into real, locked-in focus takes somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes on its own. And that's for average cognitive work. If your job involves complex, multi-layered thinking, connecting ideas across wide mental territory, or holding competing variables in your head at once, that ramp-up runs even longer. Think of your brain like a jet engine on a runway. A jet doesn't climb to 30,000 feet in 60 seconds. It builds speed across a long stretch of ground, and only after that full acceleration does it actually lift off. Cut the runway short, and the plane doesn't go faster. It just never gets airborne. That's what a 25-minute Pomodoro block does to a deep thinker. It hands you a runway that's already half the length you need. So when you sit down and spend the first 10 or 15 minutes feeling like you're pushing through mud, that's not failure. Your brain is loading context, pulling up related ideas, and building the mental scaffolding that lets you think at a high level. It's slow on purpose. Strip that phase out, and you don't get better output faster. You just skip straight to shallow work and never notice the difference because you never saw what was on the other side. Now here's where Pomodoro specifically runs into trouble. It gives you 25 minutes total. If your brain needs 15 to 20 minutes just to warm up, you're left with maybe 5 to 10 minutes of actual deep thinking before the alarm fires, and you're told to stop. That's not a work session. That's a warm-up with a very annoying ending. And the cost isn't just those lost minutes inside the block. The real cost is what you never get to. The best thinking, the kind that actually moves your work forward in a real way, happens in the sustained period after the ramp-up completes. Your brain starts connecting ideas faster, holding more threads at once, and generating the kind of output that takes half the time to produce because you're finally running at full speed. Most popular productivity systems never let you get there. They interrupt the session right when it's about to pay off, and then they count that as a completed work block. It's not. It's a stopped warm-up. Once you stop fighting the slow start and start scheduling around it, your sessions stop feeling like a grind you have to push through. You build the runway into the plan. You expect the fog. You don't panic when the first 10 minutes feel unproductive because you know what comes after them when you actually let it arrive. The shape of your whole day shifts, not because you worked more hours, but because you stopped cutting off the part of each session that does the real work. And once you see what that interruption actually costs you at the neurological level, the case for a smarter structure becomes very hard to argue with. You're finally in it. The ideas are connecting, you're holding 5 threads at once, and the work is actually flowing. Then the alarm goes off, and just like that, the whole thing collapses. Not pauses, collapses. Most people assume a 5-minute break is just a small pause, a quick reset before you pick back up where you left off. That assumption is wrong, and the research on what actually happens in your brain after an interruption makes it pretty hard to argue otherwise. Researchers found that after being interrupted, it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully return to the original task. Not 5 minutes, 23. And that's for average cognitive work on average tasks. If your work involves holding a web of interconnected ideas at once, the recovery cost runs even steeper than that. So why does it take so long? When you're in deep focus, your brain isn't just thinking about one thing. It's maintaining a whole mental structure, related concepts, half-formed connections, working theories, all of it running at the same time. That structure took time to build, and when the timer fires, it doesn't freeze that structure in place so you can come back to it later. It starts to fall apart. You come back from your break, sit down, and the architecture you spent 20 minutes building is already crumbling at the edges. You're not resuming. You're rebuilding, and you're doing it from a weaker starting point than before. Think of it like pulling scaffolding off a building before the concrete sets. You can put the scaffolding back up, sure, but the work underneath doesn't just pick up where it left off. You're patching, not building, and that's a completely different kind of effort. There's also a chemistry problem happening underneath all of this. When you're deep in focused work, your cortisol is low and your dopamine is running the show. That's the state where your best thinking actually happens, calm, absorbed, locked in. An abrupt alarm acts as a mild threat signal. Your brain reads it as an interruption to something important, which triggers a small cortisol spike and pulls you out of that low-stress state fast. It's not dramatic. You're not panicking. But the chemical environment that made your thinking sharp just shifted, and it takes time to get back there. Do that enough times across enough days, and something worse starts to happen. Your brain begins to connect the feeling of sitting down to work with the feeling of impending interruption, because that's what it keeps experiencing. The low-grade dread you feel before the timer even rings isn't irrational. Your nervous system learned it. You trained it, one alarm at a time, without meaning to. There's one more layer that doesn't get talked about enough. Deep thinkers naturally operate in what neuroscientists call a hybrid cognitive mode, blending focused thinking with diffuse thinking simultaneously. Focused mode is narrow and task-specific. Diffuse mode is wider and associative, the kind of thinking that pulls ideas together from different areas and finds connections you weren't consciously looking for. Your best ideas don't come from focused mode alone. They come from that hybrid state where both modes run at once, and that state takes time to build and sustain. Pomodoro's structure doesn't support it because the system is built entirely around focused mode, short sprints, hard stops, so it keeps cutting off the associative layer right at the point where it starts generating real output. The timer doesn't just interrupt your work. It interrupts the specific brain state that makes your work worth doing, and the more you rely on it, the harder deep focus gets to reach every single time you sit down. So if the timer is the problem, the fix isn't to just ditch the structure entirely and hope for the best. So what does a morning actually look like when you build around your brain's warm-up instead of fighting it? It starts with accepting one thing. The slow start isn't going away, so stop budgeting around it like it will. Schedule it. Make it the first official part of your session, not the shameful preamble you try to skip. This is the ramp-up protocol, and the idea is simple. You treat the opening stretch of your work session as a runway, a deliberate low-pressure entry into the work where you're not supposed to produce your best output yet. You read through your notes from the day before, sketch out the problem you're working on, or do a lighter version of the task itself. Not procrastination, not filler. You're giving your brain time to load the full context before you ask it to perform at speed. Now, this runs against most productivity advice, which tells you to attack your hardest task first thing. And there's a version of that advice that's right, but it skips a step. You want your hardest task in your peak window, after your brain has fully warmed up, not at the very start of a session, when you're still clearing the fog. Throwing a complex problem at an unwarmed brain is like asking someone to sprint the moment they walk out of bed. They'll move, but it won't be their best run, and they'll feel worse for it. So the runway runs for roughly 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how complex your work is, and then you move into your main block. No timer, no countdown. What you set instead is a completion anchor, and this is where the system actually separates itself from everything else out there. A completion. Anchor is a concrete, specific marker of done that you define before you start the main block. Not work for 90 minutes, but finish the first draft of this section, or solve this specific problem and write up the solution. The work itself tells you when to stop, not the clock. This matters because it keeps you in flow until a natural exit point, and your brain exits cleanly from natural stopping points in a way it simply doesn't from arbitrary ones. There's a psychological reason for this. Your brain holds unfinished tasks in a kind of active tension, which is why incomplete work keeps nagging at you even when you're trying to rest. When you stop at a real completion point, that tension releases. When you stop because a timer went off mid-thought, that tension stays open, and it bleeds into the rest of your day as background noise, a low hum of unfinished business that drains your focus without you even noticing it's happening. Put the two pieces together, and your morning runs like this. You open with a deliberate runway that lets your brain load up without pressure. Then you move into a main block with a specific exit condition already defined. You're not watching a clock. You're working toward a finish line you drew yourself, and when you cross it, you stop. Clean exit, full resolution, no loose ends pulling at your attention for the next 4 hours. This isn't a small tweak to your schedule. It's a different way of thinking about what a work session is actually for. You're not filling a time slot. You're building toward a specific output, and you're giving your brain the runway it needs to get there at full speed instead of cutting the engine right when it finally gets going. Run this structure for a few days and notice what the end of your day feels like. Less scattered, less like you put in time, and more like you actually finished something. That's not a mood shift. That's what happens when your brain gets to complete its own sentences instead of getting cut off mid-word by an alarm. Your brain has a runway, and every session where you ignore it is a session where you never actually take off. That cost adds up across weeks and months of work that never hit its ceiling. So start tomorrow with a deliberate warm-up. Set a completion anchor before your main block, and let the work decide when you stop. Run that structure for 1 week and track your output and your energy at the end of each day. Both will shift. If you want more systems built around how your brain actually works, subscribe and you'll get them regularly.